Hello and welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Gayatri Arun Kumar and I teach at the Indraprastha College for Women, Delhi University. I will be taking this module on moral psychology of criminal behavior. We will be starting with an introduction, the history, philosophical perspective, psychological perspectives, especially the stage theory by Kohlberg, self-model theory by Blasey, moral domain theory by Turiel, followed by research on psychopaths by Blair and Nichols, and to conclude with the recent trends in moral psychology. The learning objectives are the following: to delineate and understand the specific field of moral psychology, to get a historical perspective of the origins and growth of moral psychology, and the keywords of interest are moral reasoning, moral development, moral domain, psychopaths. Moral psychology is of great interest to human beings, and we often tend to help people we've never seen. We donate time and money to species that we'll never see either. What is it that is there in human beings that makes you help another person? What is it in the norms that we follow? What is it in humans that we have a tendency to transgress these norms? Moral psychology has been a distinctive and captivating area of study for philosophers and psychologists alike. Moral psychology is the study of the way humans think of morality, make moral judgments, and behave in moral situations. So therefore, what is it that compels us to engage in complicated moral thought and behavior? What is it about us that enables or compels us to follow moral norms or transgress them? Moral psychology is a systematic inquiry of how morality works, when does it work, and breaks down when it doesn't work. To illustrate further, the insights from evolutionary psychology, biology, and psychology points in the direction of human evolution and the analogues of morality in non-human animals. It turns out that our humaneness, traits of cooperation, empathy, reciprocity, distributive justice, violence, and de-escalation are shared in many ways with non-human animals. Developmental psychology offers the insights into the stirrings of morality in babies. It is remarkable how even infants and young children demonstrate the ingredients of morality, whether in empathy, compassion, hierarchy, in-group, out-group distinction, and punishment. Social psychology contributes with insights from social cognition, attitudes, in-group cooperation, and intergroup conflict. Moral psychology today has emerged as an interdisciplinary field with contributions from philosophy, evolutionary biology, game theory, neuroscience, and social psychology. The specific focus of the present module is to present a glimpse of how the field incorporates questions, insights, concepts, models, and the myriad methods from various branches of psychology, which includes personality psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, social psychology, evolutionary psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, sociology, anthropology, criminology, religion, and from philosophy, it touches the branches of applied ethics, normative ethics, meta-ethics, and experimental philosophy. Since the time moral psychology became accepted as a formal branch of psychology, the battle of good versus evil has been studied in all dimensions to further add to the core understanding of criminal psychology. Now we begin with the history and the philosophical legacy of moral psychology. Moral psychology began with early philosophers such as Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. They believed that to know the good is to do the good. To know the good is to do the good is the principle they analyzed, and the ways in which people make decisions with regard to moral identity. The central theme of the early philosophical debates was rationalism versus sentimentalism of morality. What propels morality? Is it reasons or is it passions? Whether morality is now a function of reason or emotions was a very important debate. By the early 18th century, British philosopher Samuel Clarke, 1675 to 1729, was one of the first proponents of rationalism. Clarke, the rationalist, believed that every rational human being would agree that it is wrong to injure the innocent. Another person, Hutcheson, 1694 to 1746, countered Clarke's claim that moral verdicts are issued by purely rational capacities. Rather, Hutcheson proposes that moral verdicts are based in a kind of emotional response. David Hume, another philosopher, 1711 to 76, also maintained that morality originates in emotions rather than reason. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, however, reaffirms the rationalistic approach. Kant proposed that moral law is delivered by reason, common human reason. This was followed by another psychologist called Kohlberg. And now we're coming into the psychological perspective called the stage theory. Empirical exploration of the psychological basis of everyday moral judgment waited until the 20th century. The first systematic investigation of moral judgment was initiated by developmental psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg between 1927 to 1987. He was inspired by Kant's rationalistic morality. Kohlberg offers a rationalistic account of moral development, according to which there are 6 stages in moral development. Kohlberg's theory emphasized that sound moral reasoning would innately motivate moral action. According to him, stage 1 of this stage theory is driven simply by the desire to avoid punishment. The 6th and final stage is driven by abstract moral principles like Kant's moral law. Kohlberg's 6th stage theory of moral development generated enormous interest and research programs. In trying to understand moral behavior, researchers historically adopted a cognitive, rationalistic approach that emphasized reasoning and reflection. Participants in a typical Kohlbergian study are presented with morally complex scenarios. For example, a person stealing a drug for his sick wife, and then were asked to explain why the agent's action was right or wrong. The explanations are then coded as corresponding to the one of the 6 stages. A significant result was that not everyone achieves the highest degree of morality. Each stage, according to Kohlberg, is morally superior to the earlier one. Kohlberg suggests that the process that normal people go through as they advance through the stages is akin to the process moral philosophers go through in justifying higher stages of moral reasoning. The stage theory given by Kohlberg has rather demanding tasks. The participants have to give detailed reasons for their evaluations about situations involving competing moral considerations. Turiel, developed a simpler method, the moral conventional task, to explore moral understanding in children. Children in Turiel study were asked a series of questions on simple violations, which are antecedently regarded as moral violations. For example, one child hitting another. Or conventional violations, for example, talking during story time. Research findings indicate that even 3-year-old children will distinguish moral from conventional on several dimensions. This moral domain theory by Turiel is in contrast to Kohlberg's stage theory, in which morality is viewed as a series of hierarchical stages. Turiel's moral domain theory in 1983 then proposed that moral reasoning is distinct from other forms of social knowledge, such as societal and psychological knowledge. Turiel outlined 3 domains of knowledge: the morals, or the principles of how individuals ought to treat one another; the societal, or regulations designed to promote smooth functionings of social groups and institutions; and thirdly, the psychological, an understanding of self, others, and beliefs about autonomy and individuality. Beginning in early childhood, children construct moral, societal, and psychological concepts in parallel domains rather than in succession as proposed by Kohlberg's stage theory, in which children are first selfish, then oriented to familial, and then to societal regulations, and finally formulating principled morality in adolescence. According to Turiel's moral domain theory, the morality now includes concepts of physical harm, psychological harm, the distribution of resources, freedom, and rights. Yet another significant theory in the psychological realm is by Blasey. This is called the self-model theory. Though the area of moral reasoning was supported considerably by the theoretical works, little conceptual thinking was initiated about relations between moral cognition and moral action. While Kohlberg's series of early studies and theoretical articles emphasized the role of moral reasoning, critics such as Blasey suggested it failed to adequately function as a predictor of moral motivation. In 1983, Blasey initiated the link between ideas of moral cognition and moral action. Blasey proposed the self-model theory based on the assumption that moral reasons are functionally related to action, and in order to predict moral behavior, one must first examine the moral judgments. Blasey's self-model theory is described through a set of empirically testable propositions. It is characterized by influences from cognitive psychology, which recognize the central function of human cognition in the appraisal of truth; general psychology, as it acknowledges a basic duality of motivation but stresses the normative pull of cognitive motivation; and the input from developmental psychology, recognizing the self as the central explanatory concept, establishing both the sense of personal responsibility and the dynamism of self-consistency. There has been a lot of research on psychopaths in this field by Blair and Nichols. James Blair in 1995, building on Turiel's work, studied psychopaths on the moral conventional task. In addition, Blair found that while non-psychopaths showed very significant responses to images of bodily suffering, for example, an image of a crying child, responses from psychopaths were far more muted. Psychopaths, for example, showed diminished emotional responsiveness to the suffering of others. They had muted responses to the sufferings of others. Thus, Blair proposed the importance of emotions in moral judgments, wherein the deficit in emotional responses leads to deficit in moral understanding. Hence, psychopaths have a deficiency in basic moral understanding as they have a deficiency in emotional responses. Another researcher, Sean Nichols, in 2002, in his work, argued that psychopaths also have relatively intact rational capacities, which are equal to the rational capacities of many people. For example, young children who do exhibit a normal basic moral understanding. What differentiates the moral deficiencies of psychopaths to the emotionally deficit? Nichols 2004 examined how empirical data on psychopathology suggests that moral rationalism is false. Lastly, in this module, recent trends in moral psychology. Recent models of morality proposed that moral identity is the source of moral motivation, while empirical studies on moral exemplars have shown that moral identity has been developed through moral action. Theoretical studies, on the other hand, have shown that moral identity was developed through concepts of moral cognition, moral reasoning, and moral functioning. An individual has moral identity in such a way that he or she has constructed in his or her sense of self around moral concerns. When morality is important to an individual, it heightens the responsibility to live a consistently moral life. Hardy and Carlo in 2005 raised critical questions for future research on moral identity as it relates to moral behavior. Is there a causal relationship between moral action and moral identity? What sort of factors influence the development of moral identity? Are there moderating variables between these two and moral behavior? Hardy and Carlo, 2015, elaborated by providing a greater understanding of moral motivation and commitment. Moral identity is, they suggest, the extent to which a moral person is important to a person's identity. Is being moral important to a person's identity? To some, and to conclude the discussion, the wide-ranging ideas and research briefly presented above make the study of moral psychology a provocative and engaging resource for all concerned with moral judgments and moral or immoral behavior, and to add significant value to the study of criminal psychology in particular. Thank you.